Hi friends, it's Grace and welcome back to another video. This is going to be my February wrap-up talking about all of the books that I read last month. And so my reading so far this year has been pretty productive in terms of what my numbers usually are. So I finished 8 books in the month of February, which is down from January, but 8 books is still generally like a really good month for me. And that is 8 books coming in at just around 4,000 pages, which means that the average book length was about 500 pages, but as you will see, we do have one book in particular that is dragging that average up and in fact makes up about a quarter of those pages all by itself. So my average rating for the month of February was 4.16, which is honestly still, I don't know how that compares to my average, but that's still quite a good overall average rating. I think it's probably lower than my normal, but still above 4 is awesome. And making up that rating, I had 1 3.25 star, 1 3.5 star, 2 4 stars, 2 4.25s, and 2 5 stars. So a very good distribution all around. And I think that this time, sometimes I will review the books in order from lowest rated to highest rated, but I think this time I am just going to go with the classic order in which I read them in the month of February. So the first book that I have that I finished last month is a book that I don't have a physical copy of, and that is The Last Ranger by J.D.L. Rosell. And this is one of the Spiffbo 9 finalists that I am reading as a part of the project to read all 10 of the finalists. And I will have a more in-depth review of this book along with 2 others going up very soon because I'm doing sort of like batch reviews for them as I read a few of them at a time. So this will have a semi-dedicated review coming on the channel, but I gave The Last Ranger 3.5 stars, and this is sort of like a adventure revenge type of fantasy story where our premise is that our main character is a ranger in a place called the Titan Wilds, and the inciting incident for the book is that her ranger lodge is somewhere where all of the rangers live in between their actual expeditions. So she is sent out on one of her regular, like, rangings, I guess is what you would literally call it. And while she is absent from the lodge comes under attack. And it is a absolute devastation of the rangers. And we are left with her being like alone, essentially. And so she wants to solve the mystery of who it could have been that attacked the lodge and solve the mystery of who did this. And alongside all of this, she is grappling with powers that she has inside of her that she has always been taught to abhor, essentially. The powers that she has belongs to a people that she is pretty prejudiced against, and so that is an internal struggle for her. And so this was definitely, I would say, an engaging book, but the overall reason for me giving it 3.5 stars is just because when I eventually averaged out all of my scores, my enjoyment was impacted by the fact of following our main character, because I had trouble with her internal thoughts and feelings sometimes, found it very difficult to get invested in her, and it was a bunch of mixed feelings just because I could get invested in the quest that she was on and her purpose for pursuing her goal, but it was her actual personality that I had trouble with. I didn't really like her, but like overall I didn't completely, you know, knock the book for that. I tried to see what it was doing well, and so I just landed on a 3.5. Okay, the next book that I finished in the month of February was A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, which I know is widely considered to be a favorite of this series. I think book 2 is just generally what people consider to be the peak, and obviously not having read the whole series, I can't say that for sure, but I know that I did enjoy this a lot more than book 1. I gave this 4.25 stars, and honestly, I just had a lot of fun with it. The storyline in general, like I wasn't necessarily predicting where it was going to go, but certain parts of the storyline definitely went the way that I thought they were going to, but in a positive way, because I enjoy the certain kind of tropes and dynamics that were being explored through that part of the like interpersonal relationships. Okay, so I have a whole set of opinions on the idea that the love interest in here is like a toxic male character, and the fact that so based on reading other reviews, there are clearly people that think that the main love interest in this book is completely irredeemable and this whole thing is toxic and terrible, and I don't know. I personally didn't have a problem with that. I literally had fun with it. I thought that I understood the growth between characters, and there are some, like, if you want to know what I think with spoilers, you can, like, if you're on Discord, you can message me and ask, but I didn't have a problem with these things. Like, I thought that this was pretty well done, honestly, and the only problems I can really point to that made me not fully just like let go for the ride of this is that I did have some pacing issues towards maybe like the 70% mark, where there was a section of the book where I felt like we had a bit of a side quest without really a good explanation of why we were doing this. And all I really needed was like a simple explanation of why, but I couldn't figure out how this was fitting in with the rest of the plot and the rest of the pacing. The ending of this was really, really fun. Like, that was kind of crazy and like twisty and turny, and like I was along for it. Like, I was in support of it, all the craziness. But yeah, there was a little bit of a lagging point for me. Overall though, like for the most part, really engaged with this, read it really, really quickly, and just enjoyed myself. So despite the fact that like this is a lot of people's favorites, I'm hoping that I still enjoy the third book. And I don't really know when I'm getting to that, but I think these are ones that I'm just kind of like slipping into my TBR whenever I have time, because even though they are kind of objectively chunky books, they're not slow to read. Like I said, like very, very easy to read and just a fun time. Okay, the next book that I finished in the month of February was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and it honestly feels kind of comical to have this come on the heels of A Court of Mist and Fury, because, and I don't want Evie to literally kill me, like send me to the execution, but I gave Frankenstein 4 stars, and I know, like, it just sounds ridiculous because Frankenstein was beautifully written. I enjoyed it way more than I thought that I would, but I don't really know what to say. This book just has 4-star vibes. Like, maybe I would rate it higher upon reread. Like, I completely respect what this book was doing, and like I said, the writing was beautiful. The things that really, really struck me were the appreciation for nature and the appreciation for human emotions, and just the way that she wrote these expressions of human emotion and the depth of like pain and suffering that Frankenstein's creation experiences, and the kind of like descent into guilt and madness of Frankenstein himself. And there really was so much to love about this, and like I did love it, and I completely am so happy to say that. But there's also just something about it. I do think also that until the setting comes full circle, at first the letters that the book begins with feel very, very jarring, and I was kind of thrown off guard with that beginning, so I wasn't sure what to do with myself. Like, that definitely impacted my rating just a tiny bit. And I do appreciate once it comes full circle at the end that going back upon reread, it would be much more clear what the purpose of those are. But I really don't have anything but good things to say about this, and I still have a bookmark in this book just because this edition that I have has critical essays in the back, and I've been reading those very slowly. Like, I considered the book finished when I actually finished the text, but I'm interested to read these like curated essays and criticisms, because I think that they're really cool, because they take 5 different types of critical perspectives, and that's just like, even aside from it being about Frankenstein, that's just kind of a way for me to learn about literary criticism, because I have no formal training in this. I'm literally just telling you my thoughts and feelings, and it's not official. Well, it's official because, like, it's not like I'm lying, but it's not official in any capacity. So it's kind of nice to learn about, like, what actual critics do and the tradition of different lenses of criticism. So that's besides the point, but I am still, like, reading this, but not actually. Okay, next up we had another Spiffbo 9 book, which is The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Kaplan. And so I gave this one 3.25 stars out of 5. And this is an interesting one because I do think that this book has quite the personality, and that is definitely a large positive for it in terms of its memorability. But also, just to mention, this is going to be part also of the in-depth review that I do for these Spiffbo books. So once again, I'm not going to go as in-depth with it, but I think that when it comes down to it, like, The Fall Is All There Is kind of not completely jiving with my personal style for what I like for a main character's internal voice and, like, just the general feeling of it. So I think that's why it didn't completely work for me, but I absolutely respect the kind of, like, vibrance of the story that C.M. Kaplan was telling. So our main premise here for the book is that our main character, Peter Mercy, was one of a set of quadruplets that were born to essentially a royal family. And this setting that we're in is sort of like sci fantasy because it has nobles and it has this monarchy or just a general royalty set up here. And there is still some of the traditional kind of societal setup that you can recognize there, but you also have very, very individualistic aspects of this setting too, such as the fact that a lot of these larger dwellings for well-off families are actually built in the bones of massive animals that are remaining from these previous, like, world-ending events. And there have been 2 world-ending events, and they kind of came out of different outcomes of, like, humanity essentially ruining the earth, except we did it in 2 different ways. So now, after the last kind of catastrophic event, the land that is left now has a very interesting mix of sort of like cyborg technology with, like, the ability to have quite advanced medical procedures, and, like, you can grow human tissue and combine it with, like, metal, and I don't know, there's a lot going on there that I don't think I fully understood just from reading the book once. Like, it's sort of like laying the groundwork for it because, of course, we're focused on our main character who has, at some point around 5 years ago, when he was just going into adulthood, he decided that he didn't want to be a part of, like, really the royal succession, and so he left his other 3, like, members of the quadruplets at home doing what they do with politics, and he kind of struck out on his own and found another place to live. He just really didn't want anything to do with all of that. But come the present day, their father has passed away, and it is actually time for the succession to happen. And so there is kind of a clash going on here where his siblings, 2 of them, both want the throne, and they're both kind of gonna vie for his allegiance, and he wants to stay out of it, but he realizes that he does have to go back and be a part of this because he doesn't want to, like, he doesn't want them to think that he opposes both of them and then have his whole family kind of coming after him. So it is it's a compelling book in general, and the sibling relationships pretty much take front and center stage, and they are interesting, but I think that one big negative, and it sounds kind of funny for me to say this, to be fair, but one big negative for me was a lot of the violence in here, and I think that it's a very specific complaint that I have because obviously I am not just generally opposed to violence. Like, I love Joe Abercrombie, like, enough said, but I found that in this book a lot of the fighting that was being done was like in close quarters or with these futuristic weapons that we don't really understand, but I just found that there was a lot of injuring of people going on where they really should have been incapacitated or really should have like screwed them up, but they're just kind of fine and they keep fighting and like their bodies are being destroyed. But like I found some of it really unrealistic and it took me straight out of what I was reading. And I honestly think that that might be my biggest complaint, because it sounds like a small one on the surface, but like I said, on multiple occasions, it just completely took me out of what I was reading. And I think that that was the big thing about it. So honestly, I think I talked for longer than I meant to about this, but regardless, it's still going to be in the other review, and that is The Fall Is All There Is by C.M. Kaplan. Okay, the next book that I finished in February, I don't have to check my notes or my Goodreads or whatever at all to let you know that this was 5 stars, and that is The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. So this is the second book in his Age of Madness trilogy, and I mean, sadly, the second last book in the First Law world. Like, while I'm simultaneously super excited to get to Wisdom of Crowds, I'm also just, I'm gonna be so sad that it's actually finishing. But regardless of that, this book is freaking amazing. This series is amazing. The tension and the like mixed feelings about people and characters in this being opposed to each other and on opposite sides, but like you see reasons to root for all of them, and you don't really want any of them to like die or be defeated necessarily, but some of them you do, and some people kind of get what they deserve. And there's so much happening here. The commentary on like the Industrial Revolution is crazy and like perfect. And the characters are just so good. Like, you know, you say that every time, I say that every time about every book of his, but they drive the book. They are so compelling and interesting and fun to read from. And like I said, like you don't really, like the tension is crazy leading up to some of the things in this book, because like there are characters that are opposing each other and you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop when there's no turning back from what's going to happen, but you don't really want either one of them to lose. He does that so well. There were some characters that are extremely frustrating, but there are most characters who, even if they have questionable morals or they're just straight up a bad person, you're still kind of rooting for them. So I can't wait to see how this series concludes, because it is just so crazy good. Okay, next up we have a book that I have the physical copy of, but I actually listened to it on audiobook, and that is Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka. So I've had this physical copy for a while, and I've actually wanted to / planned to read this for quite some time as well. I think that it was like maybe November or something when I actually put this on my TBR. But what I realized in the past month or so is that I was looking for an audiobook, and it's not as though an audiobook doesn't count towards the time that I spend reading, because of course it does, but it's also a totally different subset of my time. Like when I'm in the car commuting to work, I obviously can't read a physical book, or when I'm out for a walk, for example. So like so much easier to actually fit this into my February if I chose to do it as an audiobook. And when I found out that my library had it, I was totally on board for that, just because, like I said, I've wanted to read it for a while, and this was the easiest way for me to fit it in. So this is a sort of like, I wouldn't call it a thriller at all, even though it's about a serial killer and about bringing him to justice. This is more of a slow-paced literary fiction that is a character exploration of a lot of the people who were involved in the lives impacted by this serial killer. So our, I don't want to call him the main character, but our like inciting character, shall we say, is Ansel Packer, and he is awaiting his own execution within the day. and he is, when we're in his chapters, reflecting on like what he could still possibly do to get out of this and what his life has been like. And he has a philosophy of morality that he still believes in that essentially exonerates him for his crimes, but it's very much like the reader knows that he's just trying to excuse himself. But the bulk of the book is spent with 3 women who were a part of his life, 3 important women, and the 3 of them together, like one of them is his mother, and this is kind of who we start the book with after we get his perspective, because this book is not always in chronological order, but the first part that we spend with his mother kind of has to do with some of his childhood and the setting that he was growing up in, and like some things that his mother was powerless to do to like help him or to stop from happening, and basically the lead up to a certain event in his early childhood. Then the other person that we follow is the sister of his ex-wife. So the sister is someone who kind of was able to see him from an exterior point of view and was a little bit suspicious of the type of man that he was while he was with her sister, and started to kind of see certain signs that he may not have actually been like a well-adjusted person necessarily, and there's a lot of history there as well. And then finally we follow a New York police detective, and this is also a little bit intertwined without his whole life, because the detective also was sort of like an orphan and knew him in the system when they were both children, and also has some experiences that lead her to believe that perhaps he could be capable of some pretty horrifying acts, I guess you could say. Like that seed was planted. And so the story intertwines all 3 of these women's perspectives, and it follows their lives throughout the time, like before, leading up to, and after he is apprehended for the crimes that he did commit. So it's a very, very interesting balance and an interesting like combination of perspectives. I enjoyed the structure of the book. I really like the way that it was approached. Did I even say that I gave this 4 stars? I don't even think that I remembered to say that at the beginning, but I think that so much of this was done really well. The emotions and the approach to like the sensitive topics of how a lot of these women were treated by this man, all of that was really, really kind of like intentional, and I thought sensitively done, while also being sort of set in a grim reality. But for some reason, the entire time I was reading this, I kind of felt at arm's length from it. Like I really never felt like I completely fell into it and fully felt it. So that just kind of reflects my 4-star rating. This is the type of book where if this sounds remotely interesting to you, this type of literary fiction setup, I would definitely recommend it, because I can totally recognize that the book did well for itself. Like it did what it was intending to do. It's just 4 stars because like I can recognize that it's really good, but I didn't have that extra emotional response for it, for me personally, to lift it to a higher rating. That's pretty much all I can say. Okay, so now we have the book that, surprise, surprise, was just upping the average page count of my reads for the month of February. So that is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I am so happy to have been getting back to this series. This is my 2nd time reading The Way of Kings. I read all 3 of the at that time published works in this series in preparation for Rhythm of War in 2020. And then I read Rhythm of War when it was released. And so this year I'm doing the same thing. It feels absolutely bonkers to me that it has been almost 4 years since I read this, because I think I read it approximately June, July-ish of 2020. So not quite 4 years, but 2020 to 2024, suffice to say. And this, I'm so happy to say that it held up. I will say that this was still 5 stars for me. I just had so much fun. I love it. I will say that as a more experienced fantasy reader and just reader in general now, I think I'm in more of a position to recognize that Brandon Sanderson's writing is not his strongest attribute by any means, and I know that that's something that most people are in agreement on. His writing is not bad. It's just not a Joe Abercrombie or a Robin Hobb. Like, it truly is that transparent prose that is delivering the story to you, and that's it, and that's fine. Like, I think that his word choice is still good, and I think that he still does a really good job of conveying emotions of the characters, and that's a really important point, especially for Kaladin, for example. But I think that for me, it's all balanced really well by like the characters and their goals, the world building especially, the magic, just everything that we learn in here that comes together. Like, there truly is so much going on that I don't mind that the writing is not complex, because for me, everything else is complex enough. Like, and to have it actually delivered to you in a straightforward or relatively straightforward way, I think personally really works for what he's trying to deliver, and he does deliver it. And I loved this just as much the second time as I did the first time, possibly even more, because a lot of the things that probably just straight up didn't make sense to me the first time make a heck of a lot more sense this time, especially because I started my Brandon Sanderson journey with the Stormlight Archive, and so not only do I pick up on foreshadowing within the actual Stormlight Archive, but after that, you know, I read Mistborn and Elantris and Warbreaker, and so things from the entire Cosmere, even though it's been a while since I read those things, any kind of allusion to that, it makes a whole lot more sense to me on this read, just through pure like osmosis of things that I have learned that I don't even know that I know now, because I don't remember learning them necessarily, but they're in my brain. So this was so fun, and I can't wait to get to Words of Radiance. My whole plan is to read one of these books per quarter, so I'm probably going to read Words of Radiance in like May, but that seems so far away because the second quarter of the year, of course, will be April, May, June, so probably right in the middle of that quarter, I'll read Words of Radiance. But if I don't know, if I'm too excited, then maybe I'll read it in April, but then I'll have such a long wait before Oathbringer, so I don't know. But yeah, it's enough to just say that this is still 5 stars, and it's so exciting to have gone back to one of what I considered my favorite series and just still love it. Okay, the 8th and final book that I finished in the month of February is The Troop by Nick Cutter, which is another book that I've had on my TBR for quite some time. I remember hearing about it a long time ago and putting it on my Goodreads, and it wasn't something I actually bought for myself. I got this book from my cousin because she had read it and was looking to pass it off. And even after all of that, like wanting to read it for quite some time, when I pulled it out of my jar at the start of the month, I got a little bit scared all of a sudden, because I knew that this was about like a contagion and about kind of like a worm and a troop of boys and their scoutmaster that are isolated in the wilderness in Canada and are in danger from getting infected from this thing. Like, it makes you extremely hungry and you can't control yourself. And I knew that it had body horror in it, but I was kind of like, oh, well, it's something I'm going to read eventually, like it's in the future. But suddenly it was time to read it, and I got really freaked out that I wasn't going to be able to handle it. But I ended up giving this 4.25 stars, and don't get me wrong, it is a horrifying book, but I also just thought that it was so well done. Like, the whole book's structure, like, it was so fast to read. Even though I was not enjoying myself per se, because that is not the right word for what you feel when you read some of these things, I was absolutely compelled to keep reading it. I was absolutely disgusted at points, and I think that Nick Cutter's writing is really good because he really evokes, like, he'll use extremely descriptive descriptions of things, and like, for example, things like food, where like normally it could be mouth-watering, but in the context of what you're actually reading, those over vibrant and realized descriptions actually just make you feel disgusted with what you're reading, but like that's the whole point. So I don't know, like 4.25 stars, like it's not the best book I've ever read, but I'm really kind of happy with how much I actually did like it, because I can't emphasize enough that if you have a weak stomach, probably don't read this. But if you're somebody who is okay with a little bit of grossness, then I feel like you really should read this. But I do also feel like this has been out for a while and it's been very popular. So if you're into this type of book, like maybe you probably have already read this. But if it's your first time hearing about it and you don't mind body horror, I would recommend it. And I also apologize in advance as well. You know what I mean? Like it's a recommendation, but it's not at the same time. So do with that what you will. Okay, so after talking for longer than necessary, as I always do, those are all 8 books that I read in the month of February. Kind of a mixed bag, but also some extremely strong reads, and overall, a month I will look back on fondly, especially thanks to The Trouble with Peace and The Way of Kings, 2 absolutely phenomenal and stellar fantasy books that I know will be among my favorites forever and ever. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below if you've read any of these or if you want to. I would love to hear from you. And as always, I will have my socials and my Discord with Ben linked in the description below if you're interested in any of that stuff. Please like this video if you liked it. I will have more for you soon, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye!